Imaging, Part 3. In this nugget, we talk about imaging, and this is all in line with the exam objectives for the 70-680 relating to preparing your images. One of the key things you'll have to know about preparing images, though, really relates to some of the key DISM commands, which is the Deployment Imaging Service Manager. What we do with this is there's several different options you can use to both mount your images and then to modify them, to add drivers, to do a bunch of the other things that we'll talk about here. We'll also talk about updates. There's not really a clear path to updating your images automatically, but there are some ways that you can get there. You just have to kind of go through some intermediate steps. You may have to use SCCM or WSUS or some other things. We'll take a look at language packs here as well, and for volume licensed customers, they can add language packs to existing mounted WIM files, so that's kind of handy as well. Also, there's drivers. You might have devices that you need to have drivers for, and they may not be included in the out-of-the-box drivers. Well, you can add those in. And we'll take a look also at how to add in applications such as Microsoft Office 2007. This past weekend, my son-in-law and I decided to go backpacking out in the backcountry of the Sedona, Arizona area. And it's a beautiful country, beautiful area. We camped right by a creek, which in this photograph would have been off to our left over here, or also behind me from where I was taking this picture. This is just a photograph that I took where my camera was mounted on a tripod. My son-in-law was sitting by the campfire there. And then I took several other pictures throughout the night using a special kind of a timer called an intervalometer. And it would take 6-minute exposures consecutively throughout the night. And then using software, I blended them all together. And what we're seeing here up in the sky is star trails. It just composited all of the streaks of the stars as the Earth was rotating, and then I was able to composite 20 different photographs all together here to show the star trails as the night was going on. It's not really possible to capture a picture quite like this in a single exposure, so that's why we have to have all of those 20 photographs to be able to make that happen. It's kind of like that with Windows deployment too. There are probably, for some things that you want to do in Windows deployment, man, there may be 6 to 10 different ways to do the same thing. It's just a lot of different ways of going about it. There may even be actually 20 ways to do some things in Windows deployment. For example, even doing something like installing a driver in an offline image. You can use a lot of different methods for doing that. Well, when it comes to Windows 7 deployments, and by the way, almost everything we're talking about for all of Windows 7 deployment also applies to Windows Server 2008 and especially Windows Server 2008 R2. But when it comes to those operating systems deployments, we're kind of moving away from an older tool called ImageX, which is still a good tool, but we're probably moving more into another tool called DISM. And this stands for Deployment Image Servicing and Management. And also, DISM and ImageX are very similar in a lot of respects. Some of the options or command line switches that you can use are the same exact switches or very, very similar. Also, they're both command line utilities. If you've had experience using ImageX, it will probably be an easy jump for you to go to DISM. Now, I would like to point out that most of the ImageX commands will still apply to Windows 7. However, Microsoft has a tendency to like to emphasize new tools that come out with their newer operating system and so forth. So I'm just telling you that my educated guess here is that if you have to choose between knowing something about ImageX and knowing something about DISM for exam purposes, I would certainly focus on DISM. And so here's where I'm going to definitely put my emphasis on the deployment items that we're going to be talking about here, which is primarily for preparing a system image for deployment, and it usually has to do with adding something, whether you're adding drivers, language packs, updates, applications, whatever it is. But a lot of that can be done with DISM, and one of the key there are several key options here that I think you'll just need to be familiar with. Okay, just trust me on this. Be familiar with all of these different options. One of those would be DISM / get WIM info. Now, one of the reasons why you'll need to know that is because a lot of install.wim files, or any of the other WIM files that you may have custom created yourself, may have actually multiple operating systems packed inside of them. Remember, the install.wim actually contains all the different edition of Windows in many of the DVDs that you'll have, or many of the ISO files you might be working with. And you need to use this particular option in order to identify which operating systems are there and what they're actually called. There's also an index number for each one of the operating systems that you may need to know about as well. And I'll be demonstrating some of these as we go along here as well in a little bit. But one of the other things you'll want to know about there would be the mount WIM item. The reason for this is because once you find out, because of WIM info, once you find out which image you want to work with and what it's called, you want to mount that WIM file so that you can do a number of different things. Number one, you could just browse the file system. It'll actually look as if it were a running operating system, even though it's not actually that's not actually the case. It just exposes the folder structure and all of the files that are contained in it. And when you want to operate on anything within it, it makes it sound like we're playing the game Operation. Yeah, if you mess it up, it makes a big buzzing noise. Anyway, if you want to perform any actions on an existing WIM file, you have to mount that WIM file so that you expose all of its contents and then can modify it. Then when you're done working with that file that you have previously mounted over here, you'll want to unmount that WIM. And by the way, you'll also want to accompany that with, and I'm kind of skipping down here, with this commit WIM. That is if you want to save your changes. So if you were adding a language pack, for example, you would unmount the WIM and you would also use commit WIM on the same command line, and that would save the changes. On the other hand, maybe you'd made a mistake and you want to discard your changes. You would use a /discard, discard. All right. The other thing you could do here, let me go back to where we were here, is to work with a scratch directory. Now, you don't always have to specify a scratch directory, but for some operations that require operations, I use that word again. Maybe you want to remove the wishbone from out of Windows. I don't know. For some functions that you do, you might need a lot of scratch directory space. This is kind of like a paging file, only it's for working with WIM files. And what this does is it allows you to have a large transfer space to transfer files in and out of the system. So, for example, if you had something like a language pack that you were installing into a mounted WIM file, well, that requires about 1 gigabyte of free hard drive space, and you need to specify that using the /scratch directory option, and you would just specify whichever directory you wanted. The other thing you could do there would be to use something called cleanup WIM. What this is going to do is it's going to delete any of the resources that a mounted WIM had, but that have been abandoned. It'll just pretty much do exactly what it says. It'll clean up a mounted WIM. And then you can also use the remount WIM here. And this is going to be useful if you have a WIM file that for some reason has become inaccessible, and it makes it again accessible for servicing purposes. And this might be the case, for example, if you had a properly mounted WIM, but the machine unexpectedly rebooted, or something catastrophic like that happened. Well, you could remount that WIM. Although my advice is, I would just discard it so you can start clean and not be concerned about any potential corruption in the WIM file. Now, one of the big concerns about using images in order to deploy to your organization is that you could be missing certain critical updates, especially those that relate to security. You see, the importance with our updates is that we want to try to prevent a vulnerable window of opportunity for hackers. Let's say that the image that we normally deploy to our desktops is 6 months old. Well, there may have been dozens of security fixes that have come out in the meantime since the time that we originally created that image. That means that the first time we apply that image now to maybe a new employee's new computer, well, they're going to be outdated by about 6 months until they can get the appropriate updates. And it might be that there's a hacker just waiting on the wire, or a very educated but disgruntled employee that's looking for a security exploit that may know about that could seize upon that window of opportunity. So that's the big thing about updates. Now, if you want to go ahead and apply updates, you can do it a couple of different ways. You can do it offline. This means that you can just mount your WIM file, for example, apply an update, and then seal it back up again. Or you could do it online. That would be with an existing online image that's already booted up on an actual machine. But in order to do this, you need to have the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2010. That's not hard to come by. I've already got that myself, in fact. But the key thing here, you also have to have System Center Configuration Manager 2007, which is an entirely different infrastructure and a whole new learning curve. So probably we're not going to be able to get the updates that we really want if we want to do something like an offline. Particularly, this is where most of the emphasis would probably be. Probably not going to be able to do those offline updates on your images unless you have both of these products, and especially this second one right here. So for small to medium-sized businesses, that's going to probably leave us out of the fun there a little bit, but there's still hope here, so just hold on for a minute. The other thing you could do is just apply your updates to the thick image. By the way, what do I mean by thick image? Well, that means that I put everything in my master image, my image that has the halo over it. Remember, the one's our perfect image? Well, that would be one where we would just apply the latest updates to our image and then start redeploying a new version of that same image. We don't let it get 6 months old. Maybe we only let it get 2 or 3 weeks old before we reapply whatever the current updates are and then deploy that new image to any of our new customers or our new desktops. And it's obviously called thick because we keep packing new stuff in it. We update applications, we update our security updates, all those kinds of things, and it gets thicker and thicker as it goes. This contrasts, by the way, to what we would call a thin image. This would be one that maybe didn't have no apps, no updates, no any other configuration of any kind. Just the bare minimum, maybe the company wallpaper, and that's it. Well, how do you get those thin images to have the stuff that you need for your clients' productivity? These things are very often done after the image is deployed, then through a series of scripts or System Center Configuration Manager or other utilities, you then apply these during certain phases, but they're still going to be applicable to the user, and the user can still see and use those different features once they log on for the first time. That's usually how that works anyway. But the other thing you could do, apart from all of these things, is you could just use something called Windows Server Update Services. Now, we'll talk more about updates at a later point in time in detail, but what this would allow me to do is, I would have a thick image, maybe it's 6 months old, doesn't have all the most current updates, but as soon as it joins the domain, and that may be included in an answer file, so maybe when it starts up the first time it joins the domain, then it will contact the WSUS server really pretty much immediately, start downloading any updates that apply to it, and then it will probably have to be rebooted, and then it'll be back in business. So we may still have a somewhat vulnerable window of opportunity there, but it's going to probably be pretty narrow. You can use System Center Configuration Manager to do the same thing. You see, both of these servers are capable of allowing clients to contact them, identify which updates they have, and if they are out of date, then it will send to that client the updates that they need. And this also applies to something called a group policy and some other things. But again, we'll talk more about that in more detail in a later nugget. Regardless, though, remember, we still have a vulnerable window of opportunity. We still haven't downloaded these, or we're in the process of downloading them, and maybe within 20 minutes, we would be sealed up just fine. What could you do to help mitigate that? Well, it's kind of running out of space down here, but you might want to consider using network access protection. And this is something that you can use that applies to certain clients that don't have the latest antivirus updates or the latest Windows updates and things of this nature. So that if they don't have the latest updates, what happens is they get shoveled off into a different part of your network. Maybe it's a VLAN, which is a virtual local area network, or maybe they get shoveled off into a different subnet of some type, and they are not able to contact the rest of the network or be contacted by anyone else on the network except for the WSUS server and or the SCCM server. And then once they get all of their applicable updates, then they get released back onto the rest of the network, but by then they don't have a vulnerable window of opportunity anymore. So I guess the summary there would be that if you don't have SCCM and you can't use any of the more elaborate methods for your updates, just use WSUS and a thick image. Okay, you can use as thick an image as you can anyway. It's going to be outdated eventually, but then just allow WSUS to apply to it, and also use NAP, and then you shouldn't have that vulnerable opportunity. Another kind of a change that you might want to make to your image when you prepare them is to add language packs. Of course, this is going to be more important for people that work for maybe multinational corporations or something. What you'll need to do in order to make this happen, if it's an offline image, again, that means you're just working with a WIM file. Again, maybe your reference WIM or something. You want to mount that image, again, using DISM. Okay, so use DISM to mount it. And then you need to also make sure that you have obtained the proper language pack. So, for example, with French, I think it's FR-FR. With Hungarian, I think it's Hungarian is HUHU. Let me write that again. HU. .cab, they all end in .cab, by the way. So this would be the language pack for Hungarian. Well, now what do you do with that? Well, you have to apply it to the mounted image that you've got, but it only works on Enterprise and Ultimate. Oop, I forgot the E on the end of Ultimate there. Only works on Enterprise or Ultimate. Other editions of Windows are not built for accepting additional language packs. Now you can buy, let's say, Windows 7 Home Edition. You can buy that in French or in Hungarian, but you can't add multiple languages as language packs to whatever it is that you bought off the shelf. You have to have Enterprise or Ultimate. And then the other thing with that is, you can't just go to the Microsoft website and say, hey, I want the Hungarian language pack and I'm going to download this. Because it's not really available to the general Windows public. You have to be a volume licensed customer, and then you will have a special website that you can go to download that, as well as kind of some other really cool, super sexy tools that you can use to manage Windows and things. So we are kind of left out of some of the fun there, but most of the things we're still fine with, but this is one of those things you can't get. Also, if you want to work with the language pack, you'll need to create a Scratch directory. Again, whatever drive you create that Scratch directory on has to have at least 1 gigabyte, 1 gigabyte of available space. And then what you would do is you would use the DISM command with the /add package. This works not only with things such as language packs, but any other kind of a package update. So, for example, maybe there's some kind of another update that needs to apply to Windows. Maybe it's some kind of a feature pack, or maybe it's something that adds additional functionality or something. Well, most of the time, again, those will come down in .cab files, and you can use the add package to add those other cab updates if you want as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you what you would type in to make all of that happen, and it's going to be useful for not only showing you what you would do if you needed to open up an image for applying language packs, but also for things like drivers or updates if you also had SCCM. But we'll get you at least started on the right path for mounting and working with an image file. So by way of example here, you can see that I'm using the DISM command. Now what I want to do with this is to get some WIM info. I want to find out, for example, this install.wim that we see right here, I want to find out what edition of Windows that is, because if that's the Home Edition, that's not going to do me any good if I'm trying to add a language pack. So I'm going to do DISM get WIM info. By the way, you see there's a kind of camel case in several cases here, but the DISM command is entirely not case sensitive. But this is the way Microsoft shows it, and so that's why I'm going to show you here as well. Plus, it's a little bit more readable using this kind of caps. Anyway, not case sensitive, but I'm going to do a /get WIM info space /WIM file. In other words, what WIM file am I looking for? Well, it's on my D drive. There's no spaces in this, by the way. Okay, it's on my D drive in my WIM files directory, and the name of the file is install.wim, and I just copied that off of the Windows 7 Enterprise Edition DVD. Once I press enter, you can see here then that it examines the contents of that install.wim file. It finds that there's an index of 1, meaning that there's only one operating system in this particular install.wim. Remember, sometimes you'll have more than one. And then the name of it is Windows 7 Enterprise, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so what I want to derive from this is I need to identify either the index or the exact name right here in order to be able to properly mount the appropriate WIM file. And then you can see what's going on here is I added another command here, DISM space /mount WIM. That's exactly what I do. I want to mount this WIM. And then the WIM file's name is, again, there's no spaces, WIM files, and then it's the install.wim file that I referenced earlier. Here I do a /index:1. Now I could have also typed in /name:, and then typed in quotation marks exactly Windows 7 Enterprise. That's how Microsoft usually demonstrates this on TechNet, which is their kind of online encyclopedia of how to do a lot of this kind of stuff. But my thinking is, why in the world would you want to type all of that? And just type index 1. It's a lot easier. And then mounted dir, and then it's on the D drive. Mounted WIM is the name of the folder that I have created there. And now you can see that it's mounting that particular folder. And here what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you that we can actually expose that in the file system. And then once that image is mounted, then I can actually work with that as if it were on my local, drive C or something. Here, let me drag this across here. You can see here, give it a little more space, that I'm on my D drive, and I'm in the mounted WIM directory. This is the same look as it would have if I had actually deployed this to a physical hard drive. Then it would have this exact same folder structure. And if I wanted to add something into one of the users or into the all users profile or something like that, if I wanted to add a data directory, whatever I want to do, I can do all of that stuff, and then later on using DISM, I can seal all of this up and commit the changes and save it back into the WIM file, and it's a pretty cool way of working. But while all of this is exposed, I can also do things such as add those language packs. Let me show you how I would do that if I had one. Alright, now then, if I did have a language pack that I could inject into this WIM file, which is now mounted, I would use DISM /image, and then pointing it to whichever directory it is that has the mounted WIM, and it's the mounted WIM directory that I've got. And you'll call this whatever you want to. I just call mine mounted WIM. /scratch directory. Remember, I told you earlier that when you work with language packs, you have to have a scratch directory, and it's on my D drive, and I just created a folder there called scratch. Again, you can call it whatever you want. /add package, /package path, and then D://, and I've got a directory there, and I'm just going to drag this over and show you where that is. My D drive, it's a folder I have called languages, HUHU, which I still don't know. I'm assuming that's Hungarian. But I actually got this out of the Wake, the Windows Automated Installation Kit ISO file. So this actually will not work because these cabinet files right here are designed for Windows PE. Even though this one doesn't prepend with WinPE here, it's actually designed for that. So I could press enter here, but it's going to give me an error message in a moment. If I were an enterprise customer with a volume license, then I would have gotten a lp.cab file or something similarly named from Microsoft from our volume licensing website, and it would allow me to apply that to an image. But as I said before, this one won't actually work because it's designed for WinPE. I think we'll see that here in a moment. Yeah, see, it says it's not applicable to this image. And so we see the problem there. And there it tells you right there it's designed for WinPE language pack instead of just a generic Windows image capture. Now what I did here was clear the screen because it was getting kind of cluttered there, and then I ran DISM. Now what I want to do with this is to unmount the WIM. You don't want to leave a WIM file indefinitely mounted. You want to get in, make your changes, and get out. So what I wanted to do was unmount the WIM. The thing is, remember I didn't have the right language pack anyway, so I'm just going to discard any changes that might have been made there. If I liked the changes, on the other hand, I wouldn't have typed discard, I would have typed commit-WIM. And that would have then saved the changes. Then you also have to tell it what the mounted directory was that you were working with, and in this case, it was on my D drive and mounted WIM. But again, of course, for you, it'll be wherever you decide to work with it. The directory that we're talking about here, by the way, the mount directory, is really just kind of your staging area where you're going to make all your changes. Now, notice what happens here. It starts to unmount the image. Looks pretty good. We're at 30%, 40%, 50%, 75%, 90%, 99%, and 100%. Wow, that's pretty good, right? Normally, if something's 100%, that means it's completely done or it's completely good. So if you get 100% on a term paper as a college student, you're pretty excited because you had no mistakes. If your doctor tells you you're 100% healthy, wow, that's fantastic news. It's kind of like that with my psychologist. He said that I'm 100% fit for trial now. That's supposed to be a good thing, I guess. But anyway, so it turns out that that's supposed to be a good thing. In this case, you get all the way to 100%, and you still have an error. Go figure. And who knows what in the world that is. But here's what happens. It says the directory could not be completely unmounted. Why is that? I think I still have it open here. Let me go show you. Yeah. Remember earlier I was showing you this language pack? All I did was click on this cabinet file. As a result of my having selected it in Windows Explorer, it killed it right here. Just because of the fact that I selected that one file, even though that wasn't really part of the mounted file, really. And then, so what I did was I had to close that in Windows Explorer. Actually, I had some other Windows Explorer windows open as well. I had to close all of them, even though they were not related to the language file. But then I did the whole thing over again, and then you can see here that it completed successfully. So I just point that out to mention that if it does not let you completely unmount the WIM file, close any windows you have that might be somewhat directly or indirectly related to that image file that you were working with. Now, periodically, you'll also want to add drivers to your images. So, for example, if you think that a lot of your clients might need a specific printer driver, you could include those in your thick image. So on your reference machine, you'll just install that printer, for example, and supply the drivers from the manufacturer, especially if they're, of course, not out-of-the-box drivers that are included with Windows 7. Then when you apply that reference machine to your clients, they'll, of course, have it. The other thing you could do, besides this method, is you could use Windows Deployment Services to install a driver package. And the way that looks is that if you notice in Windows Server 2008's version of WDS, there's now an item down here called drivers. This is actually very, very handy. You can see here that we have all packages, but you can also add a driver group. And the driver group is just a way of segmenting different categories of drivers, and it's kind of arbitrary. You just do it according to whatever your own requirements are. So maybe I want to set up a group for printers. Okay, so I'll set up printers, and then it starts out a little wizard here, and I can specify what kind of hardware filters I might want. So, for example, I might say I only want computers that are Dell computers to have this driver. Can't really think of a good reason for that, but that's what comes to mind. So I'd say manufacturers equal to Dell, and then I would click on Add, and so forth. You can also choose BIOS version, the chassis type, the universally unique identifier, lots of other criteria. If you leave this empty, then it will apply to any computer regardless of its hardware. And then on the next part of the wizard, for some reason the wizard keeps opening on my other screen, so I have to keep dragging it over here. But on the next part of this, you can do an additional filter as well. And with this one, you identify things such as which operating system it is. This is more of a software type of a filter. Well, let's click Add, and you'll see OS version is equal to, Windows 7 or something like this. Okay, so you can add specific values for that as well. And again, if you leave this blank, then it'll just apply to all computers. And then once you click on Next here again, what you'll see is that it will install the driver packages that match a client's hardware. So, in other words, if the client does not have the physical device attached to it, for the driver that you want to install, it won't actually install the driver package. So it's only going to install it for people that actually need it. You can also choose to install all driver packages in the group. And that might be useful if you think that a client will have certain devices attached to it at some point in the future, but might not right now. For example, maybe a certain brand of smartphone. Well, the client might not have that attached to the USB port on their computer right at the time they turn on their computer, but they might, tomorrow. So that might be an idea that you could use there. And then once you click Next again, then you'll just click Finish. Now notice that I haven't actually installed any drivers yet. This has to come up next when I go to the drivers item there to right-click and choose to add a driver. So then what I would do with this is I'd just simply right-click and choose Add a Driver Package, and then the wizard that results from that would allow me to choose either an INF file or all driver packages from a folder. Either way, it actually uses INF files. Here's an example. This is a printer driver for my wife's printer upstairs. And let me tell you how lazy I am. Sometimes my printer will run out of paper, and so I'll print to her shared printer, but we don't have drivers for her printer. So that's why I have to add these drivers right here. And then what I'll do is I'll print to her printer upstairs in our home here, and then I'll yell up the stairs and ask her to bring my print job down to me. Isn't that terrible? Oh my goodness. I hope she never finds out that I do it strictly for the reason that I'm out of paper. But anyway, this is the INF file for the printer that she has, which is, where is it? This one right here, the ML1430 Samsung. Okay, and so what this does is it identifies which operating system it'll work for, which is a Windows NT based operating system. That actually applies to all current versions of Windows. It tells us what the catalog file is. Within this catalog file are a bunch of other files that the driver needs. The class GUID. Every plug-and-play device has a unique identifier, and it will identify itself on plug-and-play detection. So when plug-and-play sees that there's devices that it doesn't have drivers for that match this GUID, then it can reference all of the drivers that are included in this. Notice that there's several other printers that would also work with this item, but that's what the INF file is. And if I specify that one INF, that one happened to be for 32-bit drivers. Problem is, I need all driver packages from a folder. So I'm going to click on Browse here. And the reason why I'm doing that is simply because, and I've got them in a temp directory here, is simply because they actually have printer drivers for both the 32-bit versions and 64-bit. Now this says Vista, but these actually work with Windows 7 as well. So I'm just going to choose the GDI folder, which will include INF files for both 32-bit and 64, and then I'll click on Next. And then you can see here the two that it detects, the 32-bit and the 64-bit. Then what I'll do here as well is point something else out to you here in just a moment as I click on Next throughout the rest of this. I'm just going to click on Next and Next. And that is that there's something critically important with this when it relates to Windows Server 2008 and also Windows 7 and Windows Vista, all those current operating systems. And that is that for 64-bit operating systems in each of those versions of Windows, they're not supposed to allow any unsigned drivers. And that's the official answer. If you're ever questioned in that regard, that's the official answer, is that you cannot install unsigned 64-bit drivers. Key thing there is, I don't understand why that requirement is there, because or why Microsoft says that you cannot install them, because I've done it many times. But supposedly, you should not be able to do that unless you choose a certain boot option when you start up a computer. And here's an example of this. Notice that it says that this is a 64-bit driver, so this should be a signed driver in order to properly install, but you can see here that it shows it as a failed package, and that's because, by the way, that it is not a signed driver. So that's just kind of one of those things you may have to work with. I think it's actually a mistake on Samsung's part, because I'm pretty confident that that driver actually is signed, but I don't know if they forgot to affix the signature or whatever else they might have needed to do there, but I'm pretty sure it's actually signed. Now here's where we can work with the driver groups that we specified earlier. There's the printers item that I created earlier, so I can click on Next. And then what I can do is, if I had filters that I forgot to configure earlier, but now I want to do that, I can modify those, and then it will bring up the same filter options that I showed you earlier. And to quickly put a punctuation point on that issue of signed drivers, here's my wife's printer, and I want to go ahead and print to it, but it doesn't actually have the drivers installed. So here I'm going to choose Customize Your Printer, and it tells me, oops, you don't have any drivers. So I'm going to say, yes, I want to install the drivers right now, which launches a little wizard here. As I click on Next, we see the ML1430. Now, I have the drivers on my hard drive, but they're not actually installed. So then what I'll do is, and you can tell here that it says it's not digitally signed. It's all right. Click Next. Then I'll go ahead and click Finish. And that's pretty much it. It now has the drivers right there. So, again, maybe I'm putting too fine a point on a minor issue there, but Microsoft officially says that it will not allow unsigned drivers unless you choose it as a boot option. But I do it all the time. There's also another product that I use. I'm trying to think of what the name of it is. I think it's called Magic ISO Virtual CD Manager. That has an unsigned driver as well. I use that all the time. Never had any problems with it. Now, at the same time I point that out, I want to emphasize, of course, it's much better to have signed drivers. Signed drivers are thoroughly tested and made sure that they are very stable and compatible, and only when they've been determined to be very, very good drivers in that regard will Microsoft affix a digital signature to them. And that's a real, good validation for any manufacturers of hardware to say that they have Microsoft signed digital signatures. So definitely better to have them, but my only point here is that even if they're not signed, you can still install them even though Microsoft says you can't. Now, of course, that whole discussion about the signed drivers and all that doesn't really relate directly to the images here, so let's get back onto that. Here we have Digital Imaging Service Management again, which we could also use to add drivers. You can see here that I've mounted my Windows 7 reference image, and I showed you how to do that earlier. Once it's been mounted, notice that I did this as well. I chose DISM image, the mounted WIM folder. Okay, I'm just pointing it to whichever mounted WIM that I want to talk about. I want to add a driver. Then I point the driver to the file path where the actual driver is. Notice again, this is the unsigned 64-bit driver. It's successfully installed. So that's just another way of being able to insert the driver into an existing offline image. Another tool that you can use for working with your images to do a lot of different things, including adding drivers or applications, for example, would be to use the Deployment Workbench, or the MDT, the Microsoft Deployment Workbench. Okay, what you can do with this is to go to the out-of-the-box drivers section to add just what they are, out-of-the-box drivers. Now, this is something you can download from Microsoft. This would be in addition to the Windows Automated Installation Kit, which we've already looked at quite a bit, which also includes, remember, the PE tools and ImageX and DISM. After you get all of that, you still want to download more. You want to get the MDT. This is probably the best solution for a light touch deployment or a light touch installation, also known as LTI, short of going to System Center Configuration Manager, where you could potentially get to a zero-touch installation. But here it is. This is what I've got right here. This is the MDT. What you get with this normally is you get a lot of information, a lot of documentation and various components and things. This is actually a pretty thorough documentation, but in some respects, it's almost too much information if you want to just really get started here with everything. So you can go to the Get Started item here, and it will give you quite a bit of information there on how the whole sequence of events takes place. One of the things that's a little bit confusing about Microsoft deployments is, as I said earlier, at the very beginning of this whole nugget right here, is there's almost too many ways of doing the same thing. It gets to be quite confusing because, well, you could use ImageX if you want, or you could use the Windows Automated Installation Kit for certain functions if you want, or you could use the MDT toolkit if you want to, or you could use System Center Configuration Manager. I mean, my gosh, it gets to be a little dizzying looking at all the different things. However, I will say that the deployment workbench for most small to mid-sized organizations is probably the best way to go, and I would recommend you take a look at least the getting started portion of this. And then what we have here is a deployment share. Now, this was not there by default. I added that, and I'm going to show you how I added this through a wizard, which I'll cancel before I get to the end because I've already got a deployment share. But you simply right-click and choose New Deployment Share, and then you specify where it's located. Let's just assume that it's on Drive C, for example. And then you would just add an administrative share name. I've already got a deployment share by that name, so I have to make it unique. I'll put the number 1 in there. Then you specify a deployment share description. It's kind of arbitrary, whatever you want. And then you can ask if an image should be captured. This is what would happen if you were to take an image that you created out of MDT or worked with out of MDT, and then you deployed it to a computer. Then, after the deployment takes place, a wizard can start asking if you want to capture an image of this machine. Now that seems a little bit circular, doesn't it? I mean, after all, my whole point of this is to take an existing image and deploy it. So I would have taken an existing image, deploy it, and then capture it. I mean, there's already been a capture made, right? The reason why we would do that is because you can use the MDT to have a thin image. In other words, remember we talked about thick images before? This would be a thin image that doesn't necessarily have all the drivers, all the applications, all of the other stuff that you might want to have in it. Probably just some basic interface items and things of this nature. And then what you could do is, using your thin image to deploy it, you could then use the thin image to build a thick image. That's what this would do. After I had then subsequently added all my applications and drivers and things like that, using MDT, I could then capture that as a thick image, or at least a thicker image. All right, I'm going to clear that because I don't actually use that usually. I usually use a different method. But during deployments, users can be prompted to set the local administrator password. Here what we can do is to identify how much of the interface we want the user to see and be in control of. Do we really want just anybody who's sitting down there to set the administrator password? Well, I might not. That might be a security issue, so I might clear that item. And that would require then that somebody with administrative privilege later on go back and reset the password or set a password for the administrator account. Whether or not you want to ask for a product key, that can be provided in an answer file. We can still use the SIM, the WSIM, the Windows Setup Information Manager, to create XML files that will provide all these things, including, by the way, that admin password and the product key and activation and EULA and all those sorts of things. So the SIM can be used not only to create unattended files, which, as I said earlier, can be put on something like a thumb drive. It can also be used to create XML files you can use with other tools, such as this one. And then you just click on Next. It gives you a little bit of summary there. Then you click on Next and then Finish. And I'm going to, like I said, cancel that for now because I've already got a full deployment share that I've already been working with here that we can see. Now, what do you do with this deployment workbench? One of the key things that you can work with here is that once you're done doing whatever it is you want to do, whether you can add applications, you add operating systems, you can add various drivers, various kinds of packages such as patches, for example, task sequences, which would just be any function that you want to do, anything you could, for example, run from a command line. After deployment, you can include that as a task sequence. So you might, add certain scripts into that, and various other advanced things you can do. This has got quite a lot of flexibility, and that's why I said earlier that this is probably the last stop before you make an investment in System Center Configuration Manager. Microsoft has done a pretty good job of this, but boy, there's a lot to learn with this. At the same time I point that out, I want to emphasize that a full exploration of this is well beyond our scope. The 70-686 exam discusses a lot more detail on full deployment, and it even goes into System Center Configuration Manager. But I'm going to do my best right here to show you how you could at least get a good start on this. Now you can also see by looking at this that I've already got some things going on here. I mean, I've got some method for installing Office 2007. Let me get this out of the way. That's as far as it goes, I guess. By the way, something weird about this console here, at least in my case, normally you can remove the Actions pane. I can't seem to get rid of it here. I don't know why. Anyway, so we've got the applications that I could install here if I want. Notice that I got all these operating systems. I've also got some out-of-the-box drivers. Where did all this stuff come from? Well, I had to build it. Since it's beyond our scope, I'm not going to fully exhaust it, but for operating systems, for example, I'd right-click here to choose Import New Operating System, where I could select from my DVD or a captured WIM file, like my Windows 7 reference machine, or WDS. And that's where most of those came from, by the way. You can see here, WDS, you know, it's listed all the way down through there. Oh, great. Now what happened? I guess it stopped responding somehow here. There it comes. I don't know why it had to have a hiccup there. And then I also did, as a separate step, I ran through that whole wizard again and included my Windows 7 reference image here as well. So you can see we've got all different kinds of operating systems that we can work with here. And then for our application, that's going to involve quite a bit more discussion. I've got a whiteboard to discuss that, and I'll show you how to do that. And then here's the out-of-the-box drivers again as well. Now we're about to get into out-of-the-box drivers, but I think you might still want a little bit more background on the deployment share. Notice that I created mine on drive D, and there's a deployment share folder. Notice that it does not have a little sharing symbol on it. That's again because this is an administrative share. So it uses deployment share $. That hides it from casual view as a share, and I can only browse to it if I'm an administrator. And I enter in a UNC path to the deployment share $ share. Then we see here a lot of different items. For example, applications. Here's the applications I was talking about. Look, that's the full install files for all of Microsoft Office. There's a Visio viewer here that I could install if I wanted to. Here's the operating systems. Okay, Windows 7 x64. There's pretty much a whole package right there. Okay, I could install all of Windows from that package. Here's the drivers. Okay, printer drivers. Okay. Now, by the way, before I started here, when I first created this deployment share, most of this was empty. Most of these are just a bunch of empty folders. You populate this. Boy, my voice almost cracked. I feel like I entered puberty again. Anyway, most of these things here will be populated by various wizards and things that you do within the MDT. And then what happens with this is when you deploy Windows using images based on or born out of the MDT, it will include any applications or drivers or anything else that it's included in this deployment share. This is actually going back in history a little bit because it used to be back in the days of NT4 you could use a similarly structured deployment share to add additional files to a deployment of Windows NT. Then we moved far away from that when we used other deployment methods, with Windows XP, Windows Vista, and so forth. It was still available as an option, but a lot of people moved away from it. And now we seem to be gravitating back in that direction again using the MDT. Now, how do we actually add our out-of-the-box drivers here, since that's our current discussion? Well, you right-click here, choose Import Drivers, you browse to the source directory, you find the files that you need there. Actually, I have them in a couple of places. I'm going to go here. It's a little bit faster. I've got my printer drivers here. Okay, and then I'll just click OK. And I can also say import drivers even if they are duplicates of an existing driver, just as a matter of double checking through that if I want to. Then I just click Next, Next, and Finish. That's pretty much it. I'm going to cancel that for now because you can see I've already done that. So that's how you would add the drivers. And then what we would also do is, and this is an important part of this, is there has to be an ISO file created on this. You see, what happens is we need to have an ISO file that we will be able to boot from. And then, since it's a custom created WinPE boot ISO, then it will know about and take advantage of any of the things that we see in this. And there are also a series of XML files that provide special instructions on how to treat all of these things, and how to treat and install these drivers, and treat and install these applications that we have, and so forth. So what I would do here is once I've got this all prepared, I would choose Update Deployment Share, and then I could completely regenerate a boot image if there wasn't one already, for example, especially. Or I could optimize an existing boot image updating process. You can also compress to save some space, and then you would just next and finish your way through that one here as well. I've already got that, so I don't need to proceed on that basis. And then once you create that ISO file, you'll see that it's down here in boot, and it's called Light Touch PE x64 or x86 respectively. And this is the actual ISO file that it updates. And then you can see what I'm doing here, and I'll demonstrate this in full detail a little bit later on when we talk about a full deployment, is that I've got a virtual machine here called bare metal that's pointing to that Light Touch PE x64. So I'll boot off of that, and we're going to be able to take advantage of all the packages and instructions and everything that are specified in this particular MDT deployment share. Okay, so that's kind of how that works. And I'm going to go on here next to talking about applications, since we've already talked about the drivers here. Once I'm done with the applications, then we're going to go on and take a look at actually performing a deployment with that MDT. So in order to install the applications, there's a couple of different ways you can go. Now, one of the ways that you can do this in a larger enterprise is to use, guess what tool? Yes, SCCM 2007 or greater. I know I keep kind of going back to SCCM, but it's really just a mainstay of most major corporations, and it's so critical a part of Windows Enterprise solutions. But it does actually work very, very well. You can also, using MDT, I should point out that this is an MDT solution, you can add the source files and whatever command line is necessary to perform that installation to the applications node in MDT. So very, very efficient way of doing it, and it actually does work pretty well as well. So once you add this in, how do you actually execute it? In other words, how do you actually have the application install itself? This is going to happen after the image has been applied to a destination hard drive, and then after it boots up, one of the first things you'll see it do is actually install the applications, at least in the method that we're using here. You can identify the execution of that in the deployment wizard, which I'll show you, or you can also do it if you have a lot of customization and things you want to do with this. You could add it as a task sequence. And again, a task sequence is virtually any command or instruction that an administrator or anybody else could perform at any time while they have an interface in front of them. Okay, so a task sequence gives you virtually unlimited flexibility in all the various things that you can do. Now I'm about to show you how to make all of this work using the MDT, but before I do that I want to have a quick side note here about enabling features. You can enable certain features in Windows that might not otherwise be enabled using the DISM. First thing you might want to check out is if there's already a feature that is enabled, and in order to do that, you can type DISM and then go point to your mounted folder and then get features. And then we'll press enter here and it'll kind of scroll off here. But you'll see that once it's gotten the features, there's quite a bit there that we can see whether it's disabled or enabled. And so if I go up here, you can see all the IIS is disabled. Oh, what have we got here? All the games are disabled. That doesn't look right. So let's say that we don't really like that. And we want to make sure that we have chess enabled. What I would do here is I would enable that using the command line here as well. So I would type in the image that I'm looking at. I would enable feature and then name the actual feature. Notice that if the feature has a space in it, like I think there's one there called Internet Checkers. I would have to have quotation marks around those, but chess is pretty simple. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter here, and then we'll see that it will enable that feature. Now some of these games, for example, may depend upon other functions. And in fact, I think it says so right there. For example, it says right there, the operation completed, but chess feature was not really enabled because it has a parent feature that has to be enabled first, and that would be inbox games. So I'd have to repeat the command and type inbox games in order to allow chess to also be enabled. But the key thing here is to know that you can enable certain Windows features using DISM. Now then, returning here to MDT and talking about deploying specific applications that are not included with Windows, I could go to Applications here to right-click and choose New Application. Then I can choose to identify where the files are located for the application installation. Let me actually start down here at the bottom. I could choose Application Bundle. This is kind of weird. This will allow me to install, or rather to specify all the commands necessary to install the application, but the actual files themselves will not yet be added there. We can point those out later on if we want to. Then we can also choose the application without source files or that are elsewhere on the network. For example, if there's a UNC path to a file server where all of our source files are located, well, we could specify that. Or if we had a DFS share, then we can also choose application with source files. And then once we choose an option like that, we can also identify the publisher if we want, Microsoft, the application's name, Office 2007, And then we can choose if a version if we want to, or a language if we want to as well. Some of those, as you can see, are already optional. Oops, I guess I've already used that one. So I'll say Office 2007 Pro because I've already got it really installed, and I'm going to cancel the wizard before we get to the end since it's already done. But then I could choose Browse, and I would go to something like my source files down here, and this is what I've got. I've got these on a file share here. And then I would go to my applications, and then Office 2007 Professional, for example. Okay, and then I would click on Next. Then I would specify the name of the directory that should be created, and you can change that as necessary. And then you can also enter in a quiet install command line necessary to install the application. This can be modified later on if you want. So, for example, I might just type in MSI exec, and this is actually the function that will expose and manipulate and work with and install MSI files. And that's how just about everything is really installed nowadays. So I'd point it to the package. You would think that would be a /P, but it's actually an I. And then Office 64 MUI, something like this. Then we would click Next, and then we would click on Next again and Finish. And I'm going to cancel this for the time being because you can see I've already got a package deployed. But rarely do we actually just leave it the way it is, because we don't normally even use the MSI exec item there. It's just that we have to include it for the wizard. But if I come back into this, then we can see that we can again double-click on it and to choose a number of different self-explanatory fields here that we can fill out. And we can also specify whether we want to install it as a standard application, or if we want to do an application bundle as well. That relates to the wizard that we saw earlier. If the application, by the way, requires a reboot, then you can specify reboot the computer after installing this application. This is an important item to select. If the application, when you normally install it, if it normally does a reboot on its own, you must suppress that. You don't want it to do that, because using MDT, when you do a deployment like this, there may be other tasks that are also running synchronously with the deployment of Office 2007 or whatever your application is. It might be an update, for example. And if it reboots before that update has a chance to complete, you could corrupt something. So normally, if an application requires a reboot, select this checkbox even if the application would normally reboot on its own. Because by selecting this, then Windows would not allow the reboot to take place until other functions have completed. You can also choose various dependencies here if there are other applications that have to be installed before or after it. And then here we can specify the various Office products that we want to install. Now, normally what happened here is, by default, it actually said, let Office Setup decide. And when you choose this, it will then expose interface items that the user might have to work with. But you can also use different settings here. The PROR for the Professional actually identifies a lot of pre-configured options there that will allow the installation to take place largely on its own. I could then specify any multiple languages if I have them here. Specify a product key. I'm not going to do that for now, but I can enter in a product key. And you can see some of the other things here as well. I can bypass the EULA, so we accept that in advance. Okay, and then here again, always suppress reboot. This is what I was telling you about earlier, where if the application wants to restart itself, we don't want that to happen. So we're going to select that checkbox so it doesn't corrupt other things that are trying to take place on the way. And then we can specify here that it says that if I want to edit the XML file, that I have to apply the changes first. So let me go ahead and apply those. And then if I edit the XML, this will identify all the various things that is actually going to go through here. Okay, so if you want to modify this or custom configure any of this, certainly you're welcome to do that here as well. Let me also show you something here about the Visio viewer there. One of the key things with that is when you have to have an MSI to work with this thing. However, you don't download an MSI from Microsoft. What you download is this thing right here, Visio Viewer. Well, how am I going to get an MSI out of that? There actually is an MSI in this. In order to expose it, though, what you need to do is to go to a command prompt, and then what we'll do is to execute a certain command that exposes the MSI file for us. So I'm going to change to my D drive here, for example. And then what I'll do here is I'll change directory to Visio. Okay, and then there's our Visio Viewer file. What I'll do next is I'll choose Visio Viewer. Okay, space / extract. You can do this with a great many setup.exe files and other types of things like that to expose the MSI file. So I'll extract that to, let's say, d:\Visio MSI. Okay, I'll do something like that. And then I'm going to expose that MSI file. Now, once I've done this, and pressed enter, it's going to pop up an item right here which we can see, and I'm going to say accept the license agreement and so forth. And then it's going to give me another message here that the file's extracted successfully. So let's go ahead and check those out. If I go over here to where's my Visio item? There it is. Then we go to this. Then we can see that Visio MSI, and then now here's my MSI file along with an accompanying cabinet file. So that's how you can expose and reveal those MSIs. Now I don't think that's an exam issue per se, but very often you're going to be a little bewildered because Microsoft will say you need to work with an MSI and you can't find a way to download or obtain one. And then once we've got that exposed, then we can move the MSI files perhaps if we need to a different location or something. But here you can see I've already worked with this. I've already created this again as an additional application. And then here, just as an FYI, note that I have to know what the MSI exec command would be. If you do an MSI exec space / from a command line, it'll show you a lot of the various options. But in this example, I would again point it to the package, which is a /i vviewer.msi, a /qn, which means to quietly install it, and also to accept the EULA agreement equals 1, which means just to accept that agreement. Okay, and then you can also specify, notice this, which platform you want it to run on. Maybe I don't want it to run on certain platforms. I only want it to run on 32-bit operating systems. Okay, so you can do all of those sorts of things there as well. Pretty handy little tool. Now note that it's not enough just to have these applications here. These would actually sit there and do absolutely nothing the way they are right now. What I would have to do is also to add what we call a task sequence. This is a pretty important part of MDT. If you don't already have one, you can right-click to choose a new task sequence, but you can see I've already got one right here. And we've already seen some of these options, but the meat of this tool is on the task sequence tab right here. Okay, so on the task sequence tab, you can see you can do a number of different things. First of all, I would have to specify which operating system I was trying to install. So I'd go to Install Operating System, click on Browse. That would pop open all of my various operating systems that we saw elsewhere in this interface. And I would specify, which operating system I wanted, for example. You do have to make sure that it is visible and available from the client side of things, that they can have a clear path to it over the network. You can also specify which disk and partition it installs on. Maybe your organization uses a separate disk or a separate partition for the operating system that's different from what a lot of organizations use. You would specify that here. You can also identify down here any other custom tasks, for example, you want. For example, here I wanted a new custom task, so I clicked up here, chose Add, General, Command Line Item, and then what I did was I enabled Remote Desktop. And the command line item that I specified there was this right here, because I want Remote Desktop available on all of my clients. For the Capture Image section here, what I wanted to do was add Microsoft Office. So I again clicked Add, General, and then I wanted to install an application right there. Okay, so my application I want to install, Microsoft Office 2007. How did I get that there? Well, I clicked on Browse, and when you do that, it will expose to you any applications that you've already pre-configured. So I select one of them and proceed on using that basis. Okay, so that's kind of how we can add our various applications. Notice also that once I'm done with all of this, if I want to, I can go to Options here. Actually, that's not it. There it is, OS Info. And look, edit unattend.xml. Now, you could, of course, use Notepad, and that was something I would know for all exam purposes, that you can use Notepad to edit any of these automation files, such as an unattend.xml file. But the easier way to go is to click on the edit unattend.xml file there, for example, and use the Windows System Image Manager. This is our old friend that we looked at earlier, which we can again use to customize how Windows installs. And if I have any further items that I want with this, I just add in any additional answers that I want to have provided. If it doesn't have a distribution share here already for you, you right-click here and select a distribution share, and then you just browse to the appropriate location. I've already got one selected here, so there we are. Then what I can do with this is, notice that there's the out-of-box drivers, my printers, here's any other package that I have. But with this, again, if I want to further automate anything, I simply provide the answers that I want. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Everything is pretty well already done there. I'm going to go ahead and cancel all of that out. Remember that when you're finished making any changes that you want, you must right-click here to choose Update Deployment Share, which is the wizard I talked about a little bit earlier. It's just kind of a next finish item. And it modifies and creates the ISO files necessary to create your own DVD or CD, or to boot using a virtual machine. And then once that's been done, you'll be able to continue on. Now then, by way of example, I'm just going to boot up my bare metal machine, which you can see is pointing to the Light Touch X64 item right there. So I'm going to power this on, and then I'm going to go ahead and press Escape to go to my boot options to boot from the CD-ROM drive, and it's going to go ahead and boot there. Now, I've already had an operating system installed on this computer at some point in the past, but if I boot from that ISO file, then it's going to format the hard drive and clear the partitions and reinstall everything. So I'm going to go ahead and allow it to do that at this point. And it doesn't seem to want to quite fit on the screen here, but you can see here that this is one of the Microsoft Solution Accelerators, and when we get this launched, it's going to ask me if I want to run the deployment wizard, or if I am trying to fix a machine, I could run the recovery wizard. That's known as WinRE. Or I could just exit all of this. You can also configure a static IP address if you want. Now, I picked up one from a DHCP server I'm fine with, but you'll notice here that if you need to, you can just set that all up statically if you want to instead. Just an additional option that this solution accelerator offers to you. And the MDT is an accelerator, a solution accelerator. I'm just going to go ahead and launch that wizard. Notice that here it's asking for credentials, so trainer and okay, something like that, and then I'll go ahead and click OK. And then what we can also see here is, and I need to again reorient my windows here, but there's the default deployment options. That was the task sequence that I specified there. That's just what I titled that. You can call it whatever you want to in the MDT, and then I just click on Next. Here it asks for a computer name. Normally I'd specify something, but I'm just going to leave that here. Also remember, things like the computer name can be specified or modified using the unattend.xml file. So you could use Setup Information Manager to fully automate this if you want to. Then I'll click on Next, and it asks me if I want to join a domain. I'm going to leave this in a work group for the time being, but otherwise I could enter in some credentials there if I want to. And then I can also restore user data and settings if I want. This would be something that I would do if I previously had user state migration tool data. This is very cool because remember, we talked about USMT at a previous point in time, and normally we would install Windows, then we would have to sit at the machine, then we'd have to browse for the appropriate location for the USMT files were previously saved, and then we'd have to go through that whole slogging process. Here I could just specify the location here as part of this wizard and be done with it. But I don't have any previously saved settings that I'm using, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. Then we identify things such as the language, currency, and you know those all those sorts of things. And again, this can be automated with the WSIM, as can my time zone if I want to. Here I'll specify that I want to install Office 2007. I could also choose the Visio viewer if I want. I'll just proceed on through this. And then this is what I was talking about earlier. If this is actually a thin image that I'm deploying, well, I can deploy it as a thin image, and then I can capture it to make it a thick image. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that we can work with. Again, I can also prepare to capture the machine if I need to use sysprep with this. So again, I could do all of this manually on my own, but the Solution Accelerator and MDT packages a lot of this together for me and makes it an awful lot more convenient. And by way of example, again here as well, I could choose to enable BitLocker if I want. Some organizations, in fact a lot of Microsoft itself, has computers that have BitLocker required at all times. And I just read about this week in fact, and they cannot be unBitLockered because there's too much of a security window there that could be a vulnerability. So they have to have enabled BitLocker at all time, and they could even do this: wait for BitLocker encryption to complete on all drives before continuing. So there's no window of opportunity for someone to work with exposed files. Then what we could do is simply begin, and that would be pretty much it. And you can see here it's formatting and partitioning the disk and everything. And I'm not going to continue recording through all of this, so I'll just come back when it's completed with certain steps. And then we see here that we now have an actual operating system installed. The desktop's a little too big for my screen here, but if I kind of drag it around here, you can see that I do indeed have Windows installed, and we can see that it's running a light touch installation where it's installing Microsoft Office 2007. Oh, this is what I was talking about earlier, by the way, as well. Notice that there was also an update going on in the background. I don't know if I can show it to you if it lets me expose it, but there it is. Some updates that were going on. This is what we were talking about, when you can see how it would be conceivable that an application that was installing, if in a race condition, if it finished installing before the updates were completed, we could have wound up with an uncertain situation there. So that's why we want to allow the light touch installation itself to reboot the computer if necessary after all of this is done. And then having readjusted the screen resolution, you can see here that it is completing the installation there and everything seems to be just fine. Now that you can see here, it's also shutting down automatically. And again, that was part of the instruction that I gave the XML file. When it comes back up here in a little while, we'll then see that we have a fully installed edition of Windows with Office 2007 also installed. And then having skipped ahead here, you can see that we've now logged on for the first time, or actually the second time I guess this would be. And then under all programs, we see that we do have Microsoft Office with all of its accompanying applications. And you can see that I've also already launched Microsoft Excel. So pretty cool way of deploying applications. Alright, now before I conclude here, I'd like to just defend myself a little bit because earlier I mentioned that sometimes I call my wife and tell her to bring down my print jobs. Well, lest you think that I was bossing her around and not being very nice or something like that, I'd like to point out that I work in my home office right next to the laundry room and the kitchen. So it's often my responsibility to do the dishes and bring up laundry baskets and sweep and mop the floors. Sometimes she treats me like I'm a little Cinderella. It's a little Cinderella. Gee, I haven't been called that since the high school boys' locker room. Anyway, in this nugget we talked about imaging, and this was part 3. We talked here about preparing images using the DISM commands. We kind of looked at a few scattered commands all throughout this. We looked at how to apply updates, although primarily that's going to be the responsibility of SCCM or WSUS. We looked at language packs. Remember, with language packs, if you're a volume license customer, you can go to the special website and download those. Then we also took a look at drivers. 3 different ways primarily of doing that. You could use the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, you could use WDS, or you could use the DISM command to add those drivers. And then we also looked at applications and how to also add those in, primarily using MDT. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.